that really accelerated in 2006 when Hamas won the election. There's a democratic election. Palestinians have a parliamentary system, and Hamas engaged in a ceasefire and ran a series of good government candidates, toned down their violence, extremism, all that stuff. They didn't really emphasize that, and they won a majority in parliament. Of course, in parliament you have to rule with other people and you have to moderate your position more. Unfortunately, the West and the U.S. said, we don't want to deal with it. Israel said, we're not going to deal with it. Immediately arrested Hamas officials, and things broke down even worse after that. So what's happened in Gaza and the West Bank is there's a split. Now, Hamas rules in Gaza, and we don't like Hamas, the West and the U.S., and Israel. And in the West Bank, Fatah rules. Both Fatah and Hamas both took control of the government in undemocratic ways. But of course, we like Fatah, so we don't mention that too much. So there's this division between these two parties and these two Palestinian governments. What has happened, because we don't like Hamas, has been a siege of Gaza. On top of the violence that we saw last year, for about the past 3 years, Gaza has not been able to trade with the outside world. This is a huge problem if you need medical treatment, you want to go somewhere for education. Obviously, trade in the economy has gone horribly south. There's a lot of smuggling on the southern border here, and that provides weapons for Hamas, but it also provides anything anybody would need to black market. The U.S. is actually participating in that siege. We don't say it, but we are participating in it. We're actually helping to build a wall down here to stop the smuggling routes. This is it's a horrific humanitarian situation. Oxfam, International Committee of the Red Cross, have pointed out the dire situation with Gaza, humanitarian situation. But because we don't like Hamas, it's okay to punish the civilian population for what the government is doing, the government we don't like. And that's an ongoing problem. That's one of the things that when I go to lobby, I'm going to lobby about. And it's one of the things our representatives here in South Carolina are not very good on, of course. But we'll see.
No, I think when it comes down to it, human life is most valuable to anybody. And when you have, like with the recent Operation Cast Lead, you have 12 or 13 civilians being killed in Israel, and 1,200 in Palestine. As a human activist, which side do you take in a conflict? And I've always stuck with the heuristic that whichever entity takes more life, more discriminately, that's who we need to pressure. Now, if Palestine does it, on the contrary, takes more innocent lives, then we need to condemn Palestine. But go ahead.
Okay. All right, so this really leads us up to our current situation. What is the current political situation? I've already described the split between Fatah and Hamas. The Israeli government has gone more right-wing, as Benjamin Netanyahu. It has not, it didn't endorse, the two-state solution until it was sort of dragged into it on two-state solution that's not really a two-state solution. In particular for the Israelis, they've got a problem because all these settlers vote. How are they going to stop the settler movement if the settlers vote? They have a big problem. And from talking to both Palestinians and Israelis while I was there touring, I heard from both Israelis and Palestinians who are like, we need pressure from the outside to help make this happen. Maybe 10 years ago you would hear, okay, we'll resolve it between Israel and Palestine. Now it's like there's a recognition that there needs to be a change. During the Bush administration, the situation was horrific. The Bush administration was the most pro-Israeli president of them all. Basically, what Israel said went, and the Palestinians were the bad guys. And the Palestinians got blamed for everything. Did we have progress toward peace? No, we had a lot of violence. But this has changed, and from talking to the American political officer from the American consulate, there's been a sea change with the Obama administration. How much of a change, that's a question that we already touched upon. In his Cairo speech, he just said a lot of good things. For the Israeli side, he pushed for acceptance of Israel as a Jewish state, which of course there's still some problems with the Arab minority population within Israel, never mind the whole refugee issue. And then the Palestinian side, he focused on 3 things. 1, relaxing the checkpoints. 2, a settlement freeze. And number 3, lifting the siege of Gaza. So let me assess what has happened in the past year of the Obama administration. Obama has succeeded where Condoleezza Rice and the Bush administration failed in relaxing the checkpoints within the West Bank. It is easier for people to travel from one place to another. This does not necessarily mean it's easy to ship goods out of the West Bank yet. And it's not easy for Palestinians to go to Jerusalem necessarily. But there has been a relaxation of the checkpoints, which Israel deserves credit for and the Obama administration deserves credit for. Second, the settlement freeze. After the Cairo speech, the settlements were not frozen. Israel continued issuing settlement permits for construction. And only now they've done this sort of two-step, where they've stopped issuing the settlement permits, but the construction on the settlements continues. So really it's not a settlement freeze at all. On the Palestinian side, they say, why should we even bother to try to negotiate? Well, Israelis are still chipping away at our land and taking more and more of our land. So this has not been successful, and I would argue if the U.S. really wants to make a difference on this issue, the U.S. really has to put its money where its mouth is. Third, we just talked about Gaza. We said lift the siege of Gaza. I think the Obama administration is really just paying lip service to this because there's not enough humanitarian aid going into Gaza as is, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is building that wall on the southern border to stop the slowing. There's not enough humanitarian aid, so we're going to stop the tunnels. So that's going to make it even worse. So, why is the U.S. so pro-Israeli? I'm going to give you 3 special interest groups to consider. Number 1, we already talked about the massive military aid. Our own military-industrial complex and military contractors are profiting directly from that aid. So that's number 1. Number 2 is an organization called the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is considered one of the strongest lobbies in Washington. It's considered right up there with the National Rifle Association, NRA. Hugely powerful, has a staff of about 800. Purports to represent the Jewish community. However, recently that has been challenged by a group called J Street, which is this pro-Israel, pro-peace lobby, which has been doing a good job of challenging impact. And actually, because of this, we've actually heard more criticism of Israeli policies and what's happening, particularly the siege of Gaza, settlements, because the congressmen say, okay, well, I'm not going to get beaten up by this powerful lobby if I've got J Street helping out. And the third group is Christian Zionists. It's this idea that as a Christian, you have to support Jewish people. And it's tied a lot into the issue of Holocaust guilt. You know, Christians looked the other way while the Holocaust was happening, and so don't let it happen again. And now Jews are under attack again. That is pretty much in a nutshell the Christian Zionist argument of why we should support Israel. But they also tie it into a lot of Old Testament scripture where they say that God gave this land to the Jews forever. It ignores a lot of the other things that might change that in the New Testament. And personally, you know, from a Christian perspective, you shouldn't just care about one group of people. You should care about all people. Love your neighbor. Even, you know, Jesus said, in case you didn't get the love your neighbor thing, love your enemy.
A lot of people overlook that they're Palestinian Christians too.
Yeah, and they're not aware of this either. So, I mean, so with Christian Zionism saying, oh, we need to support Israel, they're actually turning their backs on Palestinian Christians. And, of course, not caring much about who they see as their enemy as Palestinian Muslims, who they would see as the enemy. One of the biggest leaders of this is a guy named John Hagee, who is a megachurch pastor out in San Antonio, and at the behest of a person who would become the current Prime Minister of Israel, he started an organization called Christians United for Israel, which is this very fastly growing lobbying and advocacy group that has been pushing this perspective. I've actually been to one of their events. It's called the Night to Honor Israel. They repeat Old Testament scripture 36 times about God giving the land to the Jews, and that God will bless Abraham and curse anybody who messes with Abraham and all this kind of stuff. So it's very much an indoctrination that they do when they have these events. It's very cult-like. The other thing to it is it's weird gospel of wealth kind of thing. if you support the Jews, God will reward you materially. It's embarrassing. But anyway, so, but they have a lot of power. Liberals might look down their noses, oh, those right-wing Christians. But guess what? They might not be as smart as you liberals, but they know how to contact their congressmen, which we don't do as much. So it's a very powerful force to reckon with, particularly here in the South. So this is the reason why we have this slant policy. What can we do about it? Educate yourself, educate other people.